Hello, and welcome to Texas Holocaust Remembrance Week 2021. My name is Nami Echolov, and I'm the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio's director, as well as the interim CEO for the Jewish Federation of San Antonio. We want to thank you for joining us for this special program, as well as to thank the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission for underwriting all the production costs associated. In case you'd like to see any of our other programs or other resources available put forth by the museum, please make sure to check out the Holocaust Memorial Museum's website at hmmsa.org. And now for our program. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Julie Zucker, and I'm the Director of Jewish Engagement and Learning at the Jewish Federation of San Antonio. Thank you for joining us for this important week of Holocaust education. Before our presenter, Mr. Olivier Bourgeois, speaks about his grandfather, I'd like to give you some background information on France and their role during the Holocaust. France was the main proponent to harsher restrictions against Germany in the aftermath of World War I. The French countryside was devastated during the Great War. Germany, on the other hand, had not been invaded, and besides casualties they suffered during the war, their country remained largely untouched. France wanted to ensure that Germany would not be a threat for many years to come. This desire caused the treaty presented to Germany to be extremely harsh in its terms. The German delegates were not allowed into the room to negotiate on their own behalf, and in order to avoid more fighting, agreed to sign the treaty that was presented to them. When the Germans approached the Allied powers, they were expecting to receive US President Wilson's 14 points, which touted a peace without victors. But instead, the terms of the peace treaty were dictated to them. To Germans, this treaty was seen as a national humiliation. An important note to make is that even after the war, Germany was still a major power in Europe. Russia was seen as a pariah due to the Marxist revolution that took them out of the war. France and Italy were both exhausted militarily and financially from war, and all of the major empires that had existed prior to the war were now gone. This treaty devastated the German economy due to the restrictions placed upon Germany. This atmosphere of hopelessness, despair, and poverty led the way for Hitler and the Nazis to come to power. Hitler had joined the National Socialist Workers' Party, Nazi Party, shortly after World War I, and as a rabid nationalist, anti-Semite, and charismatic speaker, he quickly rose through the ranks of the Nazi Party. By the late 1920s, the Nazi Party was rising in the German parliament, and by 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed as Chancellor of Germany. Hitler quickly set about persecuting Jews and others deemed undesirable. Hitler set about expanding the living space for his Aryan Germans by gaining territory in Austria and Czechoslovakia. The next target was Poland to the east of Germany, but the international community was not going to let Poland fall to the expanding Third Reich. With war clouds brewing on the horizon in the late 1930s, the leaders of France and England gave Poland their word that if they were invaded, they would both come to its defense. When Germany invaded Poland on September 3, 1939, World War II began. As an ally of Poland, France and England declared war on Germany. Both countries, however, didn't launch any major on-land military operations against Germany after this declaration of war. Within a month, Poland had fallen to Germany and was eventually split with the Soviet Union. After months of tension, Germany launched its attack on France on May 10, 1940. Quickly, German soldiers outmaneuvered the French forces, the Maginot Line, which France had built along the German border in the aftermath of World War I to defend itself from a possible German attack, proved to be ineffective. The German forces used a maneuver that Western journalists would name the Blitzkrieg. This strategy benefited from the element of surprise, as the opposing forces were quickly encircled, cutting off supply routes. This strategy proved to be very effective, not only in France, but throughout the war. The French had taken a position of defense during the interwar years, which led to the building of the Maginot Line. They were prepared for such a strong offensive attack from Germany, which completely bypassed the fortress of defense. After Germany made such gains, it was hard for France's forces to regroup and launch any significant counter-offense. The French government was forced to move from city to city to avoid falling into hands of rapidly approaching German soldiers. There was conflict amongst the French leadership on what to do, or how, or if they should continue to fight. To avoid mass casualties, a French delegation reached out to the Germans to enter into armistice, which stopped the fighting. This armistice divided France into occupied and unoccupied areas. Northern France came under control of Germany, while the southern area was controlled by the Vichy government, which, as the name implies, set up in the town of Vichy, France. Germany did not interfere much with the Vichy-controlled southern France, but in a gesture of goodwill, the Vichy government voluntarily enacted several policies that Nazi Germany had in place, mainly against those the Germans saw as undesirables. Unlike in Eastern Europe, Hitler saw the populations of the Western countries such as England and France as being almost equals to Germans. As a result of this, the treatment of the French citizens differed greatly from those under German occupation in the East. With the Vichy government collaborating with the Germans, France's 340,000 Jewish population came under threat. This number had grown during the late 1930s and early 1940s as Jews attempted to flee Eastern Europe and the growing reach of the Third Reich. The local authorities and some citizens, many who held anti-Semitic beliefs, such as Lucien's former best friend, helped to enforce anti-Semitic laws and eventually round up the Jews for deportations. The Vichy government passed several laws that mirrored what Germany had enacted in the mid-1930s, as French Jews were excluded from public life, could not work in industry, commerce, and certain professions, such as medicine and teaching. A process of Aryanization occurred in France as Jewish-owned businesses were given to non-Jewish citizens. In Lucien's case, not only was he helping to aid a Jewish-owned business, but he was hurting the German war effort by hiding materials. Had he been captured, he faced imprisonment and even death. What Lucien was doing was an act of resistance. He could have stood ideally by and been indifferent to the suffering of his employer, but instead he took actions to ensure that his employer was still able to function. The Vichy government was a willing partner in the deportation of thousands of Jews to their deaths. Captured Jews were sent to the Drancy transit camp in the northwestern suburb of Paris. This camp operated from 1941 to 1944 with nearly 65,000 people, 61,000 of whom were Jews, being sent to the east. Out of the 65,000 that passed through this camp, only 2,000 are estimated to have survived the Holocaust. The destination for those deported to the east was Auschwitz-Birkenau, where many were killed upon arrival. In total, 80,000 Jews were deported from France, with 77,000 being murdered in the killing centers. This is a relatively low number compared to other countries. However, this number could have been much lower had the Vichy government not willingly taken part in the deportations. The reason being that, unlike in these Eastern European countries, the Germans met opposition to the deportations. Many church leaders and the general public acted as upstanders and helped to hide their fellow man in distant towns, convents, churches, private homes, or even help them cross the border to neutral Switzerland or Spain. There were many acts of resistance that took place in German-controlled North, as well as the Vichy South. The resentment towards the Vichy government caused many French people to join the resistance movements, as well as the voluntary enforcement of the anti-Jewish laws. By 1944, there were an estimated 100,000 members of the French resistance. These resistance members played a crucial role in building up to D-Day, as they gathered intelligence and carried out acts of sabotage. After France was liberated from occupation, members of the resistance set out on what has been called the Wild Purge. Those who collaborated with the Nazis, including women, had romantic interactions with German soldiers who had their heads shaved and were publicly humiliated for what was seen as a betrayal. An estimated 10,000 people were killed during the Wild Purge for collaborating with the Nazis. Once the French government took control of the situation, a legal purge took place, with collaborators being tried in court. 300,000 cases of collaboration were investigated, with 120,000 being given sentences of various lengths and close to 7,000 being given the death sentence.
Hi, my name is Olivier Bourgogne. I was given some documents by my grandmother before she passed away. I had heard about a story that had happened during World War II in my family, whereas my grandfather had been denounced to the Nazi by his best friend. So I didn't know a whole lot about the story, but I knew about the story. And then when my grandmother gave me the documents, I really dug into them and read about it and asked my aunt about it and found out the facts, which revealed that, yes, in fact, my grandfather was betrayed by his best friend, who had sent a personal note to the German commandantur in Paris during the German occupation of Paris that not only named my grandfather by name, but also my grandmother's father, as well as precise addresses, and it was signed a Jew-hating Frenchman. So that kind of stuck with me because, you know, obviously when you hear those words, unless you're a very callous personality, that doesn't ring right. So I had these papers in my possession, but I'm not the most organized person, and even I knew they were somewhere in my office. I didn't know exactly where they were, and then eventually I would do some cleaning and organizing, and I would find them, and then they would get stored away, and then they would disappear again, and I'd say, oh gosh, where are those papers? I'm gonna have to do something with them. And one of my good friends, Howie and Estelle, said, you know, you ought to consider donating them to the San Antonio JCC Holocaust Museum. So he put me in touch with Ellen Barshop, who put me in touch with other people in that are involved with the museum. And the next time I found the documents, I made sure that I made an appointment, and I said, you know, are you interested in these? And they said, well, we'd like to see them to make sure that they're authentic, of course, which is legitimate. So we had a meeting, and at that time, during the meeting, it was very emotional for me because I really I was reading the letters really more in depth for the first time in many years, and it actually brought tears to my eyes when my grandfather talked about there's a letter where he wrote back to his ex-friend saying, you know, you knew exactly what you were doing. You knew that you could have sent me to my death by doing this, which was a fact. So the museum gracefully accepted my donation. They made copies of everything for me, and they told me, you know, we're going to at some point put together a special exhibit to honor that story and your grandfather. And months went by, and you know, nothing happened. I would check on it, and they said, yeah, it's in the works. And eventually it did come to pass that this exhibit was put together. And when I first came to see it, I was actually very impressed. I thought it was better than I was expecting. Very professionally done, very accurate historically with translations, etc., etc. So over here you have a picture of my grandfather as a younger man, in fact, holding my mom in his arms when on the day she was born. There is some different letters that attest to his work. He worked for a Jewish family out of Strasbourg in northeastern France, in Alsace, and he was like director of sales. I don't know exactly how you would call his position, but needless to say that because he took a stance in trying to protect his boss's interests, after the war he was rewarded with a lifetime position in their company. So there is an original telegram from the company that was my grandfather's employer, Roth Brothers, and here is a letter in French that says Je suis signé Moreau Lucien, directeur des établissements, director of the group Roth Brothers, and it's translated in German. It was addressed to the German commandantur asking for permission to continue the business and to move merchandise, and I'm not really sure what happened with that, but this is in 1940. Further down the exhibit, so when my grandfather found out that something was up because I guess the Gestapo had come to check on his place, and he had already taken care of moving some material away. Basically what he was doing, he was hiding some raw material that was supposed to be turned over to the Germans for their army machine. And so they came to check on his place and asked him questions and said they would be back. And so he didn't wait for them to come back. He knew something was up. He didn't know what it was, but he got on his bike. The family had already moved to near a city called Avalon in Burgundy, which at the time was not under German occupation. It eventually did become German occupied as well, but later on. So my grandfather left at night on his bicycle, and he didn't turn on the lights, and he rode as far as he could. Then he went to sleep during the day, hiding in the cornfields, and he did that for the length of time it took him to reach the family home, which is depicted in another picture over there. A house in which I spent a lot of time as a kid, because it was only an hour and a half from Paris, and we would go there for long weekends or even short vacations. But it's a home that we no longer own, but my grandmother was born in it, and my great-grandfather built it of his own hands. He actually blew up the hill with dynamite and claimed the land and used the rock from the hill to build the house. So a lot of family history in that house. Unfortunately, it didn't make sense to keep it after my grandmother passed away, so it was sold. I have since then driven past it when I was visiting France on a couple of occasions and taken pictures, more recent pictures of it. There was the friend was tried for treason, and he was asking my grandfather to intervene to see if he could intervene for leniency, for clemency. So there's the letter that the friend and his wife wrote to my grandfather, and then there is the letter that my grandfather wrote him back telling him that, I'm sorry, I just cannot forgive that. The interesting thing that my mom told me when she was already grown up, but she said that her parents did not believe in corporal punishment at all, and that she was never spanked or slapped, except one time when she was little. My grandfather, her dad, slapped her because she refused to shake hands with that man, who years later. So somehow as a child she had a negative feeling that she took a stand and refused to shake his hand and got slapped for it. The only time ever that my grandfather laid a hand on her. So that's an interesting little story. So here we have 3 letters. This is the first one, is the one that was written by the man who and his wife, and they're asking my grandfather for forgiveness, and they're kind of rambling and asking for, in the name of our past friendship and the good times we had together, and it's kind of rambling and doesn't really say much other than, we realize that we screwed up. And then this one is another letter written by the wife, where she tries to defend his actions, say he was not in his right mind, you need to forgive him, I don't know what took over him, but again it's rambling, and then finally there are letters from my grandfather where he responds and says, I absolutely will not be able to forgive. This is an abominable act that your husband committed. For whatever reason, he knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that he could send me to my death. I'm very fortunate that I was able to find a way out of this quagmire, and quite frankly, as I mentioned earlier, I think that you just thought that the war was over and France was done for and the Germans had won. And unfortunately for you, you picked the wrong side. For those of you who may not be aware, there's a series currently being viewed on Amazon Prime. It's called A French Village, and it's a really, really good series. And I even took a picture of I froze one of the frames and took a picture of it, because basically it says, anyone at the time could be an informant. You never knew if somebody from your family or your friends could turn you in. So the series is very well done. It's kind of like everything that could happen and probably did happen at some point somewhere, like it happened all in one place. Obviously that's not realistic. I'm quite sure that not everything that happens in that series happened in one village, but everything that did happen that is portrayed in that series most likely certainly did happen somewhere. It's very true to the history. There's a lot of very good historical references, so I would highly recommend anyone who hasn't seen it to watch it. It's a long series, so if you commit to it, I don't know how many seasons, but probably a dozen, I guess. I'm about halfway through it right now, but I've really thought that it was very well done. So I'm watching it in French with English subtitles, but I'm sure there are other ways to watch it as well. So, as I was mentioning earlier in the series A French Village, I took a screenshot of this where it says somebody could be denounced. Sometimes it was a neighbor or even a family member, and so that struck a chord with me, because it touches on this story of my family, my grandfather, that and I knew I was going to be coming here today to talk, so I took a screenshot of that particular subtitle, because it was definitely apropos. So one more thing about A French Village. This is another screenshot which precedes the other one, where it says, we had to be wary of everybody. Part of the series that makes it very valuable to me is that in between each season, there are snippets of interviews. It's called They Were There, and they interviewed people who were actually alive and had a part during the German occupation, during the resistance, and they give their account of what happened to them personally. And this particular person said we had to be wary of everyone. So yes, I knew my grandfather very well. I mean, I was close to him. He would come and pick me up and take me out to lunch. He had been very successful in business and was regular in some of the very top restaurants in Paris, and he would bring me in and we were treated like royalty, and I have very fond memories of him. He didn't talk much about the war. He did frequently, when the term German or Germany came up in conversation, he was not very kind to the Germans in general. He had a lot of resentment. And basically, it's one of the things that he talks about in the letter that he wrote back to his friend, when he said, you just went with who you thought was going to win, and you picked the wrong side. So. You know, because I've always known about it, in the back of my mind, it wasn't really something that I thought was extremely heroic or different, because it was woven into the fabric of our family history, and you know, it was in the back of my mind. I knew about it, but we didn't really talk about it. It's not a story that was being constantly talked about. It's just something that I knew about, that I had heard about. And I'm sure that there are many people that deserve as much or greater praise for bravery than my grandfather did. It just so happens that, you know, that's a story that's close to me, that I have knowledge of, that I could share. But it's not to take away from the bravery of others who have certainly probably done acts of heroism that were far greater. So he didn't talk about it, but they were not divorced, but they were separated. And I think she felt like I've always shown an interest in history. I really liked reading history books when I was a teenager, even younger. I got a double major, one of them in history. So my grandmother knew that I had an interest in history, and being the oldest of the children in my family, she probably felt that it would be good for me to be the custodian of those papers, because one, I would appreciate them, and two, you know, I might do something with them, which, you know, it took many, many years for that to happen, but eventually it did. Yeah, he stayed in that position for even past retirement, to be honest. So he became head of the company, made a lot of money, was paid very handsomely, and even when he retired, he had what is commonly referred to as a golden parachute, where he continued to collect his full salary during retirement. Just his job became just entertaining clients. So, you know, he was retired, but he was paid the same as before, and he would take clients to dinner or hunting or to play golf, and that was his job. Well, there are some unfortunate political tendencies, in my opinion, that are reflective of things that happened in the past, and old adage says, if you can't remember the past, you are condemned to repeat it, and certainly there are things from the past that we do not want to repeat. So I think it's important to keep to the forefront that things can change quickly sometimes when you have leaders who take control of political situations, and people start siding with the wrong side of history.
Thank you, Mr. Bourgeois, for speaking with us today about your grandfather, Lucien. The story of France and the Holocaust is a particularly heartbreaking situation. The French government failed to protect their citizens in the face of danger. Instead, they chose to work with the Nazis to remove their Jewish population. Lucien Monroe, like hundreds of others in France, chose to be an upstander and resisted against the Nazis. He and the other upstanders refused to be indifferent to the suffering of others. Being an upstander is not always easy, but the impact in doing so can help to make our world better. Being an upstander is just one of the important lessons we can learn from the Holocaust. In the words of Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. It is our hope that the lessons you learned this week will inspire you to keep learning, to make your voices heard, and to be an upstander, and not to remain indifferent to the suffering of others.